Khulna University. So now I'd like to officially welcome Professor Astrid.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ashik, for this very warm welcome to Khulna. I would say good morning from Stuttgart and good afternoon to Khulna. I feel very, very privileged to open today the international lecture series by the Urban and Regional Planning discipline at Khulna University. And I feel also very connected, Ashik, to Khulna, since we both have been working together now for quite some time. You have spent here 2 years with us at the Chair of International Urbanism at University of Stuttgart. And I think that was a time where both of us tried to push a bit the agenda for people-centered housing and planning. And we have envisaged and still push for a strong collaboration. Unfortunately, we from Stuttgart would have been with you in Khulna last year, but the COVID-19 situation just didn't allow for it. But I'm very confident that this is just a virtual start, and there will be the day, hopefully in the near future, that we'll be in Khulna also. And well, today my lecture is focusing on localizing the global agendas, because I also think this is a topic which brings Stuttgart and Khulna a bit together, yeah, because both cities have to see how they strive for reaching or implementing these global agendas also locally. And myself, I'm of the strong opinion center planning. Quick question, do you see my title slide now that I shared the screen? Yes, okay. So first of all, I would like to give you a little bit background of what we are doing here in Stuttgart, because that gives you maybe a better idea why I'm talking about what I'm talking about today. In terms of research, we are really dedicated and interested in urban transformation processes, particularly, as Ashik highlighted, in the global south, although we strongly also believe that there is joint issues that have to be studied and understood across this dichotomy of global north and south. And we are interested in that in terms of what is the role of governance, what is particularly, for instance, the role of civil society actors, how can we address the challenges of housing and informality, and how do we actually, at the end of the day, also arrive at options for actions. So here you see some of the publications we've brought about, the most recent one together also with Ashik, outcome of the last Narrows conference, and which is, by the way, also now available open access through the transcript publication house. What we do in research is also reflected in teaching. I'm the course director of an international master program, which is also interdisciplinary. It's called Integrated Urbanism and Sustainable Design. We offer this master together with the Ain Shams University in Cairo. And by the way, there is also a limited number of scholarships available through the development-oriented program by the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD. For those of you who have already a bachelor degree and at least 2 years of working experience, they can apply to this program always by end of July every year for the following year, starting in the master program. So this was a bit my commercial sideline to my lecture. I will now delve into what I want to talk about today and what I would like to discuss with you later. So in the beginning of my lecture, I just want to have a joint idea of how we can expand our understanding in how far global challenges actually create local responsibilities and then also become a concern for urban planning. And secondly, I would like to give you some background on the latest global agendas, particularly the Agenda 2030, which then takes me to stressing more the urban dimension of these agendas, particularly the Sustainable Development Goals, and also what are the underlying mechanisms to measure progress within them. Then I will take you to understand a bit better how we can foresee the role of local governments in this implementation process. And finally, and most importantly, to stress the importance to take into consideration the bottom-up processes of development and the role that people-centered planning will have for a successful implementation of the global agendas. So let me start a bit with that kind of understanding the underlying processes and challenges we have to take into consideration. There are forecasts that predict that our urban population from today 4 billion will actually increase to 6.5 billion by 2050. And the same predictions forecast that by that time, 2/3 of humanity will actually reside in urban areas. And you can see on this slide, this is a slide which was brought about by the LSE, and it is based on data by the UN. It just shows within this next hour that we will be having the lecture and our discussion, that within this next hour, there are certain cities which grow dynamically. Yeah, I think for Dhaka, you can see it would be about that Dhaka will have 74 more residents in that 1 hour. And you can calculate that this will mean that by end of the day, this city has to accommodate almost more than 1,700 residents after 24 hours. And what this brings about is a concern for it will also need to meet the needs for housing, related infrastructure, and services that will grow. So this dynamic urbanization process, it is understood that it will mostly affect emerging economies and developing countries in Asia and Africa. These predictions say that about 90% of what is happening as urban population growth in the future is expected to be in these two continents. And now this kind of prediction of dynamic urban growth is then related to challenges that are related to that, because against this background, a strong call is made to address the aligned resource consumption. And here you just see what UN Habitat itself foresees. It says basically that urban areas occupy only 2% of the total land, but they generate a lot of what makes up our GDP nationally. And then it creates a lot of consumptions in terms of energy, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as global waste. And this takes a lot of researchers and policymakers to make strong statements to say, if our cities are not sustainable, then we will not reach sustainability at all. We will not succeed in that regard globally. And the same narrative you can also see when you relate it just to the building sector itself, the resource challenges that come along with that. So a large share of the global resource and energy consumption is caused by the extension of infrastructure and buildings. And by that, urbanization is seen as an important driver, for instance, for climate change. The challenge we have to face here is that the growth of cities in terms of population growth, but also in terms of land consumption and the growth of built-up areas, is happening at the same time where we have a reduction of the available resources. All this narrative is related to an understanding of cities of being part as being the driver for this kind of changes taking place. There's another narrative, which is rather about how far particular cities are exposed to these changes. So they're not only the drivers for global environmental change, but they massively experience the transformation through mega changes such as migration or economic globalization or climate change. So with that, they also become of concern because they are the sites for this transformation, and they are maybe, at least some parts of the city, very vulnerable for these changes to take place. Against these two narratives, you see that there has been already a number of global agendas which had a concern for the urban. I call them now here the old urban agendas. They already stressed that there is a need to address development concerns, the need to upgrading, to supply water and sanitation. They also have in common that they, in a way, represent a new policy approach with principles of subsidiarity, so that things have to be addressed at the place where they appear, that it has to go about a partnership approach transcending beyond the realm of just government itself, and it takes into account the need for participation of the citizen. So these old urban agendas, some of them I've highlighted here, and you might be familiar to them, like the Agenda 21 by the UN, or the Habitat Agenda, and the Millennium Development Goals. Now, there are, let's say, the more recent new global agendas which have emerged in recent years, particularly since 2015. And in that international discourse, the role of cities with regards to sustainable development. In that sense, cities are not only seen as sites and as drivers of change, but cities are seen also as possible champions for a transformation to sustainability. And this is also the context in which the Agenda 2030 came about with its Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs came into effect in January 2016, and they're basically a universal set of 17 goals that you see depicted here. And they have underlying a number of 169 targets and a whole set of 230 indicators that set out quantitative objectives across social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. So they address critically sustainability around issues such as poverty, as you see here, climate change, inequality, economic development, ecosystem protection, and so on. And I think what we need to understand here is that these SDGs are not an agenda towards the global south in terms of development. They are seen as a universal call and are not only directed towards the global south. So also industrialized countries have to transform to become sustainable. For instance, for us here in Germany, if there is SDGs that are very much of concern to us, it is, for instance, SDG 12, which relates to responsible consumption and production. And these SDGs, and that is also relatively new, they strongly call for an approach away from a silo thinking around development. What is also remarkable with the SDGs is that it is the first time within global agendas that you have a standalone explicit urban goal, the SDG 11, and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Now, this urban dimension of the SDGs, I want to highlight to you that this is not limited to this SDG 11. If we look closely into the catalog of targets and indicators for all the 17 goals, you will see, and there's been studies done, that the majority of these targets can only be met if local actors are involved seriously. And this, there was a lot of hope given to the Habitat 3 conference with the new urban agenda. There was the hope that there will be a clear guideline how to implement the SDGs in urban areas. And the focus of the new urban agenda is rather on bringing about national urban development policies and to call for stronger urban governance, integrated planning, and municipal finance. Still, I believe a question remains: how do these global agendas generate needed action? And something that also David Satterthwaite would articulate very strongly is that we also have to learn from the delivery failures of the agendas of the last decades. I would suggest to particularly look at the downsides of the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, for instance. In the following, the answers I try to give you here is that firstly, we need to closely look at the issue of indicators and how we measure progress, because this can be very contentious. To monitor progress I will outline, require more disaggregated data and also more qualitative information than is maybe being stressed at this stage. Secondly, I believe that we need to take into account that local governments can have own commitments, which they have already aligned to through certain city networks, and commit to particular targets, for instance, when it comes to climate change mitigation. And lastly, to take strongly into consideration the role also of bottom-up urban development and how that can come together with the SDG process. Now, with my first point I want to make is about how do we actually monitor that process. And at this stage, I give you the example of SDG 11. SDG 11 is being backed up by 9 targets. I haven't now here shown all 9 of them. I just give you here some to give you an idea how such a target is being formulated. So the first target here being formulated is by 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. So this is how a target is formulated, and then next to the target, you will see certain indicators how the progress is being monitored for that. And here I give you an example to that. This is under the goal 11, the target 7, which is about open spaces. It says by 2030, provide universal access to safe, inclusive and accessible green and public spaces, in particularly for women and children, older persons and persons with disabilities. Now, on the one hand, I think this is a great success that also territorial concerns have found their way into the agenda and into the formulation of targets. Yeah, and that we take stronger recognition of the role that open spaces play for sustainable development. But then again, I'm very cautious when it is about how do we measure progress in that regard, because the underlying indicator for this target is the average share of the built up area of cities that is open space for public use for all by sex, age, or persons with disabilities. So what you see here is a clear reduction to a data which you can quantify. It is measured by square meter per person usually. And a second, what it brings about is that this data is often aggregated for the entire urban area. And this brings me to a certain concern, yeah? Because I believe that particularly, for instance, in the context of informal settlements, it might be very challenging to measure the amount of public space, and maybe just the number of square meters doesn't really tell us about the function of these spaces. So the idea that public space provides a kind of living room that allows for social interaction and encourages the identification and feelings of belonging, that is something that is actually strongly formulated by UN Habitat also in its Charter of Public Space. But still here, their emphasis is often limited to the techno-physical condition of public space in informal settlements. I believe that these public spaces are often also the starting point for, let's call it, placemaking that generates also collaborative action in the public realm, with the aim also of strengthening social ties just beyond physical infrastructure and the confines of urban design. And these approaches to slum upgrading, let's say, takes often a starting point in public space, often in streets, and there it comes about of organizing communities. And that's often much easier than organizing participation around very conflictual issues such as housing, which are complex and very conflict-laden. So here, these environments, these public spaces can be seen as catalysts for upgrading in addition to civic engagement. And the concern I have is also that if we take aggregated data for an entire urban area, we might face difficulties to actually understand what is of concern to us. I give you here a slide from Cape Town, where I have worked extensively. And if you would take Cape Town with its Table Mountain and large urban spaces, the urban space available per citizen would be looking huge, and it wouldn't take into account the large inequalities existence within the city, where there are parts of the city where public open space, public usable, is very limited to its citizens. And a concern is also that some of these spaces might be available in square meters, but are not activated, are not used. The image you see here was actually a derelict site at the foot of Table Mountain, which was then activated and adapted and used by the local community through large efforts and negotiations with local government. And that brings about really a usability of these spaces, and a usability in terms of accessibility and bringing about different parts of the urban society. As well, here from Cape Town, I show you more, let's say, micro spaces in informal settlements. These were spaces that local government had only upgraded in the way of installing water taps as part of its large servicing of informal settlements initiative, and which was taken about by a very successful program called the Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading Program. What they did is they understood that these smaller spaces can create a large catalytic effect for social upgrading, let's say. And they have used these spaces to introduce learning spaces for children under school age, because in these contexts, like in Khayelitsha in Cape Town, in these informal settlements, you have hardly infrastructure and services available for children under the school age. And here, this program has basically capacitated people for becoming educators in this program, and through QR codes, families can enroll their children for this learning program in these micro spaces. And these then become very useful public spaces for the urban communities. Now, what I want to state here for me, and which is important for me to stress, is if we want to localize the SDGs, we have to monitor the progress meaningful for your locality. Yeah, it is not only to monitor this progress in terms of becoming comparable to other cities in the world. I think first of all, it needs to be meaningful for your own city, and that will require to disaggregate the data and to also find ways to show how qualitative information is being provided for the usefulness of these spaces. And I say that because otherwise you will come to something like that. I have taken this yesterday from a source which depicts Germany's progress in terms of reaching target 11.7. And for me, this slide is in a way nonsense, yeah, because it shows the share of open spaces in 2015, I believe, compared to 2018. There is not a large difference in terms of square meters. What we don't know if these open spaces have changed in the way of how they make sense to their citizens. The second point I want to make is with regards to the role of cities itself in the SDG process. And this attention I want to draw for you because a local government at the end of the day is the sphere of government that is closest to the people. And here there's a number of guidelines. This guideline is provided by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And it indicates that local government play a tremendous role in terms of, first of all, creating awareness around the Sustainable Development Goals, to develop such a local SDG agenda, and to plan then for implementation and monitoring. And there are by now a number of examples how that can be translated locally. Here, an example from the Brazilian Association of Municipalities that worked closely with the United Nations Development Programme in terms of translating the SDGs locally and to integrate them into their local plans and also establish ways of a monitoring system. What I find very strategic and important for cities to do is to, in a way, map targets, which means to see what targets are actually already existing in development plans and to select then carefully which SDG targets are relevant actually for its localization. The example you see here is an assessment that the city of New York did as part of the US Sustainable Cities Initiative. That was at a time where actually nationally government wasn't willing to be part of the Paris Agreement, and cities themselves committed them to go forward in this process and do this kind of mapping exercise. A third important aspect for cities is to understand this as a larger idea of integrating sustainable strategies. So here the example given is from Vancouver with its regional food system strategy, where you can see how they managed to relate their food system strategy to other important parts of the agenda in order to see the interlinkages and synergies it could create. Now, finally, this process of becoming part as a local government in the SDG process has also certain surplus value in my view. It can generate and identify gaps that are useful and that hasn't been touched upon previously through development plans. It is an instrument also to more strongly communicate in the public around priorities, and thereby also maybe can create greater acceptance and legitimacy in the process. And it offers opportunity to strengthen also other local processes. At the end of the day, it could also mean an avenue to generate finance for certain local action that is needed. So very strongly, this process is not a top-down process. It can't be a top-down process, the UN agenda. It needs to resonate with what is happening locally, and therefore the context is the most relevant to take into consideration. So a second point I want to make in terms of localizing the SDGs, to implement it meaningfully, local government needs to ensure that planning is integrated. So in a way, this is maybe less a technical process than it's actually a political process that is coming about. And now the last point I want to make, and for me also a very, very important point to raise, is the role that people-centered planning has in this realm. So people-centered planning approaches focus on improving local communities, their self-reliance, issues of social justice are addressed, and participatory decision-making. In the UN Agenda 2030, there's this strong statement of leave no one behind. This is a central and transformative promise given in the agenda and with relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. So what this people-centered planning and this principle of the UN of leaving no one behind have in common is a human rights-based approach to development. So they recognize that human development is not solely based on economic growth, for instance, but needs to take into account other values such as social, political, and environmental values and practices. And in planning, it is further recognized that urban development is not solely a task in the realm of local government. You might recall the slide I shared earlier where it says that the majority of targets will need to involve local actors. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be local government. We need to understand that local development is also largely informed by the activities and projects by other stakeholders locally. So here we rather should also take into account bottom-up urban development that needs to be paid recognition for to address and localize the SDGs. And an example I would like to give you for this kind of people-centered planning is the case of the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, which work across Asia, which is accompanied by a community architects network as a kind of consultants to local processes, and with certain finance programs as the Asian Coalition for Community Action. And a very prominent example here is the Ban Mangkong collective housing in Thailand, in Bangkok. Here, the example I give is from Bangkok. And in a way, it's a particular example because it is aligned to a government commitment through the Community Organization Development Institute, a kind of parastatal which is supporting this process to come about. So the activities that are promoted by the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights have certain local global activism and practices underlying. And these networks have certain characteristics in common. For instance, they would strongly promote collective processes of mapping and enumerations in informal settlements. And for me, this has become a very important aspect to maybe align and link up to the SDG process, where we haven't yet fully paid recognition that this could be an important resource to tap on for monitoring the SDG process. It also is based strongly on so-called group saving activities. You're maybe familiar of that also in other civil society activities in Khulna, which goes beyond just loan distribution, but often these saving groups save up also for having means to combine for national or even international funds and to finance also the networking within these networks. So the exchanges, for instance, of federation groups across space to support learning activities from another. And well, all these strategies are at the end of the day meant to strengthen interaction amongst individuals and federations, and at the end of the day also to secure relations to the state and international agencies. So in particularly the approach adopted by the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights takes example of public space upgrading. So this takes me back again to the public space. Here in this case of the Canal River project, the cleaning of the riverbank was, let's say, the first initiative and the motivating factor to become part of the larger organizing process. It was the starting process really of organizing the community and maybe capacitated them for a more comprehensive form of upgrading at later stages. And what you see here is the kind of upgrading they did along the riverside. This was necessary also due to threats of flooding, but also to give a kind of public space to the community. And this process was not led top down, but was very locally rooted. You can see here how this participatory process has been summarized by ACHR guidebook. All of this information is also available online, where it's a lot of organizing also public hearings, having joint design processes and surveying processes to, at the end of the day, come to a joint solution and also to gain negotiation power towards the state, how to have local needs being addressed in this process. So for me, a third point in terms of localizing the sustainable development goals is that people-centered planning for the SDGs makes the community to partners and not to target groups of development. This is a bit borrowed from Sonsuk Bonchabancha, who is the one who has been driving the CODI model and the ACHR model in Asia. And I think it still is very valid to recognize that in ways of co-production, we need to get away from a development understanding which just understands communities as being the targets of development. With that, I would like to finish my lecture. I have included a number of references and also of, I believe, important links to that topic for those of you who would like to follow up with their own reading. And I hope I have generated some interest into the topic. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And also, you're free for sure to contact me if you have any questions at a later stage. With that, I would like to head over to Ashik again, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.